is our polity keeping us from moving into this future, or are there ways in which we need to think about our polity differently, perhaps?
Well, I think the quick answer is yes. Does it hold us back? Yes. Does it need to be looked at? Yes. But I think one of the things we have to realize, Kennetha, is that we didn't create a complex and in places a very dysfunctional book of discipline overnight. It's been created over the course of our history. And the reality is, because we didn't create it overnight, we won't recreate it overnight either. But there are some things that are just going to demand our presence. I mean, when you talk about complex matters that you need to discuss for the future of the church, you've got to be in relationship with one another. You got to be present in order to listen, present in order to strategize, present in order to celebrate, present in order to grieve. I think about that moment at the special session of General Conference in 2019, when there was a flood of people who came forward in mass, and the bishops met them there at the stage for prayer and response. You can't do that on a Zoom call. And while technology is great, you just can't substitute the real human need to be with one another in joy and in sorrow, in celebration and in grief. And, the reality of it is, while we want to move forward, our book of discipline does hold us back. And we've got to find ways together to recreate that so that it becomes relevant and meaningful in a rapidly changing context. So we've got some major challenges in that regard.
You are also the bishop of an annual conference, in addition to your general church role with the Council of Bishops, with the Commission, etc. So talk to me a little bit about that idea of needing to be present with one another from the perspective of the leader of an Episcopal area of an annual conference.
Well, a couple of years ago, I wrote a book entitled, "What Are We Fighting For?" It was a book that called us to look at the things that matter the most. What matters most? COVID-19 has had no respect for borders or political parties or theological differences. When COVID-19 hit in New York, we distributed PPE equipment to every one of our local churches. We gave a pension and healthcare payment waiver to every local church. We established standardized reopening guidelines for every setting. In the midst of lives that were in the balance, we put aside our differences, focused on ministry, and determined very quickly what mattered most. Right now, we're engaged in very substantive conversations about how we create an anti-racist annual conference. And from a contextual standpoint, it's a multi-tiered approach that's going to have to look at where people are and where we long for them to be. I just long for a day when we will plan and organize our work on the mission field and not on the preservation of our pews. We've got to get relevant again. I long for a day when we deeply respect our diversity and celebrate it, rather than always seeking a uniformity of thought and expression. I long for a day when we can join hearts and hands in creating an anti-racist denomination and a place where gender inequality is never acceptable. What we're trying to do here in New York is to plan our work around integrating our theology with our practice and focusing on a revival of evangelism that really believes that following Jesus Christ really does change and transform a life. I mean, let's weave justice and discipleship into the same sentence and find a way to genuinely turn this thing over to God and guide us instead of relying on our own frail solutions. I've been involved in this United Methodist thing, Kennetha, since I was 3 days old. I've been living with a calling to serve in this system for 47 years. I've seen it work. I've seen it work beautifully. There's no reason to think that it can't become that way again. But in the midst of all that we're facing, I think ministry's been driven down into a local level where we're having to really examine who's going to make it and who's not. And the ones that are going to make it, how are we going to resource them? And with that resourcing, how are we going to get back to the business of making disciples? The doors are open for us with great possibility. And I think it does relate to all of us in very real and practical ways in the local settings where we're living out our calling.